Welcome to the Experts in Sport podcast, brought to you by the School of Sport, Exercise and Health Sciences at Loughborough University. Today I'm with Professor Mark Williams, and we're here to discuss how elite athletes are made. We discuss a wide variety of topics, including the role of chance, based upon family, siblings, opportunities, before we delve deeper into training smarter and the science of coaching. But before we get there, hi Mark, thanks for joining me on the podcast.
Yes, thank you very much, Martin. Appreciate the invitation. Glad to join you today.
Thank you very much. Before we start discussing how elite athletes are made, mainly based around a book you wrote, it'd be good for our listeners to hear a little bit more about you and your background. So can you give us a brief introduction to yourself and your research and your work?
Yeah, I did a sports science degree. In fact, I think I was one of the first graduates of sports science in the UK back in the late 1980s. That was at what is now Manchester Met University. Then I did a PhD at the University of Liverpool in movement science, cognitive science. And then I've worked at different universities across the globe. I've worked at University of Liverpool John Moores University, University of Sydney, Brunel University London, University of Utah, and Florida State University. And my interests are mostly around expertise, skill learning, a particular focus around sort of perception and decision making, and how do we optimize the use of practice time, some emphasis on talent identification as well. And in addition to my academic work, I do a fair amount of work in high performance sport. Most of it is sort of coach education based, but a lot of sort of ongoing consultancy work around those areas as well. Mostly with football, but I've worked with a lot of sports, Olympic sports, and a range of other different domains, both in the UK, in the US, and in Australia over the years.
Excellent. Well, that's a good setting of the scene because, I mean, we've had a couple of conversations prior to this podcast and, you've said to me, fire the questions and I'll try and answer them, which is, I hope where this podcast goes because we tend to kind of have a plan, but from your book, it reinvigorated some of the things for me. I've stepped away from sports science. Now I still have an interest, but a more sports management side of things. And for our listeners, Mark actually taught me at undergrad at John Moores. And I think was one of your early academic books, was it Skill Acquisition and Motor Performance?
Yes, I have wrote, I think we're now on the third edition of Skill Acquisition. Might be fourth, forgotten. But I'm not taking any blame for teaching you or credit for that matter. It was such a long time ago, I can imagine.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean, it would have been 2002, 2003. Wow. So a long time ago. And I wasn't going to say this, but I've got to be honest, it was the worst exam result I've ever had. And I'm not blaming you for this, okay? The day before our final exam, I should have put mitigating circumstances in. Forest were, I think, 2 goals up against Sheffield United in the playoff semi-final. And Des Walker scored an own goal in the last minute and we lost. And I was devastated. Didn't do any extra cramming.
That's perfectly understandable then.
So huge excuse from me, but it wasn't my best grade. But I never went into that area. I went somewhere else. However, so you've written lots of academic books, lots of academic papers. But the book we're talking about a little bit, and I'm going to base some of this conversation on, how elite athletes are made, is not necessarily your traditional type of academic book, even though you're using research to kind of back up everything you say. What made you write the book, and who's the target audience for this book?
Yeah, I mean, you're right. It's the first popular science book that I've written. I think the motivation behind it was I'd read a lot of other popular science books in the past and felt that they were a little bit economical with the truth or stretch the truth to some degree, with the aim, I guess, of creating some kind of unique, exciting selling point to the book. So I thought that the work that I do should have interest to a much broader market than just sports scientists per se. And I thought that I wanted to write a book that was truthful to the science and that didn't spin it in any particular direction just for a sensationalist perspective. So I paired up with Tim Wigmore. So Tim is the cricket correspondent for the Daily Telegraph. So I guess I was advised to do so. People thought my writing was too scientific, perhaps. But so anyway, I got Tim involved, and essentially it was a very nice project. We sort of worked together. He would obviously had the opportunity to access a lot of elite sports people and to provide some narrative interview type material. And then we tried to intertwine the science and the narrative to create a storyline that would hopefully be compelling to a wider audience.
I know. I think
that they were the motives.
Yeah, I think you've done it really well. I think it does connect that science and the the kind of almost case study type examples that are within it that kind of back up what you're saying. So, like I said, this conversation could go in any direction we want. I think we'll potentially try and focus as much as we can on your first and final chapter, just mainly because and just for the audience listening. So, I think the first chapter is called Nature, Serendipity, and the Role of Chance in Making Champions. Then the second one is Inside the Mind of Champions, and finally Training Smarter and the Science of Success. The Inside of the Mind of Champions, we might skirt around or skip just because for listeners, we've done quite a few podcasts around psychology, and actually some of the people you name within that, their research is people I've done podcasts with already. So we might focus a bit more on some of the other elements. But before we do, and I start to ask some questions of things that really jumped out at me from the book, I want to start with a really simple question, which might lead to the whole podcast being on this. What do you think are the most important aspects of how elite athletes are made?
I mean, firstly, I'm gonna, if I may, take two angles on it. As the book talks about in that first section, where you correctly point out the section focuses on serendipity and the role of luck in the development of expertise. I mean, there is a lot of luck in being born at the right time, in the right place, with the right family mentorship structure, and then having the opportunity to engage in those sports. So there is certainly a fair bit of serendipity and luck involved. I think beyond that, of course, probably the single biggest factor is engaging in enough quantity and quality of practice in that specific domain in order to develop the skills and the competencies that are needed at the highest level within the sport. So if I could only use one word, I'd probably say practice.
Nice. So it links into all the work that you do and the type of practice, and we're definitely going to touch upon that. So before we get into the kind of coaching and practice side of things, let's talk a little bit more about the look, the serendipity side that you spoke about. One of the things you talk about within the book is about family and siblings. And can you talk to us a little bit more about younger siblings and older siblings and what that potentially means for becoming an elite athlete?
Yeah, I mean, statistically, you're 1.2 times more likely to be an elite athlete if you have older siblings, or even any siblings for that matter. I mean, the advantage of having older siblings is that they introduce you to a sport at an earlier age. They act as some form of mentor in the sense of sharing knowledge with you. And often, of course, you get the opportunity to participate with the older sibling and his or her friends in that particular sport in a play-like setting. So, yeah, statistically, the evidence is quite strong in highlighting the benefits of being born as a younger sibling in a larger family environment. And in similar ways, of course, it clearly helps if parents are interested in sport, because ultimately we need the parents to introduce us to the sport typically. Then clearly there's a lot of effort involved to take us to training, to commit the resources in some sports more than others, perhaps, to support your development as an athlete.
And there's so many examples that you talk about. So Andy Murray and Serena Williams and the Ingebrigtsens, that so many of these examples. I think you've got some examples as well around. Is it cricket where the female cricket team, the English cricket team, the female side have got so many of them have got an older brother playing cricket. That got them into it. So lots of examples. You mentioned parents there as well, and I know you've got a chapter around helicopter parenting. So where's that fine line between parents helping and parents doing too much?
Yeah, it's quite similar to the line about coaches, isn't it? In the sense to what extent coaches are hands-on or hands-off in the process. I guess the advice for parents is probably quite similar to coaches in the sense that you need to create opportunities for children to experience and learn skills independently. So I guess there has to be some effort to cajole them into the right situation with the right people and the right environment. But then we need to maybe as parents or as coaches take a little bit of a step back there and be a little bit more hands-off in the process and allow the kids to engage in trial and error learning, to see what works, see what doesn't work, learn from mistakes, not to overprotect them, so to speak, and allow them to use that as an opportunity to learn and to do better next time. And also, even in terms of there is advantages to failure at some level in that it also helps us potentially develop psychological skills like grit, resilience, mental toughness, all of which are important, of course, in terms of the elite athlete pathway.
No, definitely. And we'll touch upon lots of that practice stuff later on as we go. Focusing back a little bit on the serendipity side, and we talked about luck. Can you talk to us a little bit more about location? I know within the book you mentioned Millfield as an example and the amount of elite athletes that have gone on into elite athlete careers and the Olympics. But the one that really stuck out to me was Wagga Wagga. And the main reason I'm interested in Wagga Wagga is my wife worked there for about 6 months when we lived in Sydney. So it really jumped out at me. But I think the bigger piece. So can you tell us a little bit more about Wagga Wagga and why the area seems to produce more elite athletes, and then expand it more into that whole kind of mid-sized hotspots that you talk about?
Yeah, I mean, I think clearly when you are being introduced to a sport, it is more helpful if you have access to good quality coaches, good quality facilities. You obviously need players of a similar or slightly better level to play with and obviously to play against. And I guess if you're born in too remote a community, then there may be difficulties in getting that network of resources, facilities, coaching, and fellow players around you. Whereas in the larger cities, it may well be that there are too many kids competing for access to those clubs. So it's harder to actually get into those club environments in the first instance. Where I guess the argument is that a mid-sized town, may have that sort of conflicts of constraints that helps you become an elite athlete better. I mean, there are obviously a lot of geographical aspects to this as well, in the sense that, for instance, 75% of elite Olympic skiers are born within less than an hour of the mountains. I mean, clearly there aren't too many Olympic skiers that would come from the Midlands, for instance, in the UK, because, I mean, clearly it's a long way to travel for snow. So I'm assuming similarly those who are brought up in coastal areas are more likely to participate in cycling and a range of other factors. So physical geography also plays a big part in it. Distance runners from Ethiopia is another example and illustration of that. And even in terms of, I think you get that also in terms of popular sports across the world, like football, for instance. I mean, clearly, if you're born in London or Rio, then you have access to those networks and facilities, and there's a massive interest and passion in football, which gives you access to better facilities, coaches, opponents, teammates. Whereas I guess if you're born in a rural part of the Midwest, for instance, or in a rural part of Australia, or even in a rural part of North Scotland or West Coast of Wales, I mean, it's access to those facilities are harder to come by. So it obviously reduces your chances of having the right environment to progress with.
There's so many different aspects just in what you said there about, how close the facilities are, the level of participation. And I'm guessing that you can, well, you mentioned it really, you mentioned getting kind of limited access to something because you might be kind of slightly not good enough or deemed to be because there's too many people competing. That might potentially almost scare somebody off or move them to a different sport. Parents being able to take you to these locations. You think you mentioned passion. You've got parents and grandparents and things like that, like generational support for something. So many factors just in that kind of luck piece there. And then you did mention, I think, around competing against other people. So when I look at Wagga Wagga and you kind of look through, and I think it was in the 90s, there was two cricket players. You had Mark Taylor and Michael Slater. both in the 90s who were from Wagga Wagga. So instantly in my head, I think about the Ronaldo and Messi situation where they've both risen to heights that may be above where they're at because they were both there at the same time. And you look at tennis and you think about the players in tennis, your Djokovic's and Federer and Rafa Nadal, and the level that they all rose to. And I mean, Andy Murray getting in there with that level as well and really raising the game. Is that something linked to it as well in terms of the competition that you're playing against being slightly better than you or worse than you and relatively where you play? Do you think that has an impact?
I think clearly the challenge all the time is to have the right coaches with the right players, with the right teammates and the right level of opposition at the key stage of development. And I guess it's about trying to raise the level of difficulty in practice to create, if you like, desirable difficulties or challenge points. And I guess if you have an abundance of good players around you, then clearly you've got to adapt to those players and to develop your game. So it creates a significant growth stimulus. Whereas clearly if you're by far the best player in the local community, for instance, and it's, where are you going to get that challenge from? Where are you going to be pushed? So then there's potentially a need for you to have to relocate, arguably, to areas where you can have that level of competition. I mean, I've kind of seen it in some of the work that we've done in football in the US and in Australia, for instance. In that, if you go to rural parts of Utah, for instance, then you might be a standout player at a young age, but it's a long way to travel in order to be able to move up to that next level of competition. Whereas it's a lot easier, for instance, here in the UK, because clearly our physical geography is much smaller, and essentially, certainly in the middle of the country, access to Premier League academies is quite easy if you live within an hour or so of those academies, which gives you the opportunity, again, to get exposure to the best opponents, the best teammates, and the best coaches at an earlier stage within that network. So, if you don't have that platform, then there is a possibility, I guess, that you can stagnate and don't have the opportunity to progress at the optimal level.
It's really interesting. So you've mentioned academies there, because I was just going to mention around street sport that is also in your book, because when you're younger and if you're in an area where there is diverse levels of performance, the street sport things to me seems like a self-selected type of competition where you can get access to competition, but you're also playing against people who are older than you, people who are younger than you. You kind of find your place and find how you can perform. Can you talk to me a little bit more about street sport and where things are happening? I think there's potentially in London there's evidence of this, and I think in France in particular, in Paris, there's evidence of this street football assisting with development.
Yeah, I mean, there's certainly in the context of football, there's quite a lot of evidence to suggest that elite players accumulate more hours in street football early in development. And most of these come from inner city areas such as Paris and London, for instance, and maybe in Rio and some of the beaches of Brazil generally. And, the advantage of street sport is that people tend to recreate the conditions that they see during match play. And clearly there's no coach-based instruction. The kids play the game under very similar conditions that exist during match play. And there's little augmented feedback from coaches. So it's a real self-discovery learning environment. And again, you can often play against bigger kids, smaller kids, stronger kids, faster kids. So you always engage in problem solving and decision making in that regard. The downside, on the other flip side of the coin, of course, is that as sports have become more systematic in their investment in developing structures for elite athlete development, arguably the coaching in the last couple of decades has become a lot more prescriptive, as in too much instruction, too much emphasis on blocked repetitive practice of single skills, and too much feedback, which are good for short-term performance within that practice session, but not necessarily good for long-term learning, as in transfer and retention of skill. So clearly those street sport environments offer a lot of advantages. I'm not saying that we should exclusively focus on street sport, but certainly there are some advantages of street sport in conjunction with appropriate coach-led sessions as well. I suppose the downside is that as society moves on and there are more opportunities for kids to do things like to, play on computers, PlayStation, social media, a range of different platforms, and of course, perhaps parental concerns about safety and welfare of their children playing out on the streets, that kids are now spending far less time in street sport than they did in older generation. Certainly in my time, for instance, that's pretty much all we did in those days. We just used to hang out on the streets because that was it. I think colour television was only just coming in at the time. We only had a few channels, of course.
we did the same at my age. We were out playing football kind of, all the time. And I remember, my time in Liverpool, it was fairly well known, I think, that Wayne Rooney was playing in the Premier League and then going to play with his mates like in the streets after games. And he'd obviously been brought up playing that way.
The other downside now, of course, is there's probably a sign there that says no ball games.
There probably
outside
is.
That street.
But there was at my uni accommodation and we still played. So you get away. Any students listening, don't go and do that around Loughborough. There's plenty of space to go and play normally. But you talked about academies a little bit there, and that's of interest to me. And I know one of the quotes in your book says that 180 of the 1.5 million players become professional footballers, which is 0.012%. And again, from other research, or it's in your book, I know that many players who become professional players haven't entered the academy system till later, potentially around 12, 13, 14. I think there is some academic evidence around that. So my question there comes back to around academies and what kind of age should players be going into academies, and how can you have that more fuller experience of football? Are academies trying to develop some of this discovery learning? Is it more block-based? Or I know this is a very generic question. It's going to be very different all over the place. But I think the point I'm leading to is, at what age should you be doing this type of coaching, whether it's discovery learning or variable practice or blocked practice? Are there different time phases that players should go through, or is it the same at any age and standard?
Yeah, I think there were a number of different questions there. Let me see if I can go through them. Typically our data suggests that kids start engagement in football very early, often in organised football around 4 or 5 years of age. Football is a sport that I think you need to do what we call early engagement in. That is, you need to participate in the sport at an early age. That's distinct from specialisation in the sense that, you don't have to exclusively participate in football. I mean, you can participate in other sports, although the irony of it is that when allowed to their own choices, football players only typically do 2 or 3 other sports because typically their passion and interest is mainly in football. And of course, in countries like the UK and Brazil and most of Europe, football is the single most popular sport culturally. So a lot of people get pushed into that particular sport. Most of the academy players join the academy by about 8, and then they're engaged in this systematic training framework. I don't know what the data is actually in terms of the UK in regards to what is the average age that kids join the academy who eventually end up in the first team. Maybe your comment there about 12 years of age possibly comes from the data from Brazil. So in Brazil, for instance, the professional clubs can't access the kids till they're 12 years of age. So most of the children's exposure to football in Brazil before the age of 12 comes from beach football, back garden football, and sort of unsupervised, unstructured exposure at the local environment, not through the professional clubs as say. I mean, both those groups of kids, that is those who go through the formal academy system in the UK and those who go through the Brazilian system, actually accumulate similar hours of engagement in the sport. It's just the way that they're structured, with much more of the hours that the British players engage in is through coach-led practice. And I do want to make it clear, actually, that it's not really a differentiation between coach-led practice and non-coach-led play. It's really an issue about activity and the nature and the type of the activity that they're engaging in. I mean, really, a coach could be still leading a session, but could be very hands-on, using, for instance, constraints-based approaches to instruction in that situation, thereby replicating the same kinds of conditions that exist during street football. So maybe the part of the problem historically, although I think is getting better, is that with the increasing systemization of the academies, there was a too great focus on very prescriptive approaches to coaching. So I think we went too far on it, but there has been increasing awareness, and I think we have reeled that back now. So there are more efforts for coaches to be more hands-off in the instruction process than was the case maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, which I think is a positive step forward.
Yeah, I mean, my personal kind of opinion around it, and it'd be interesting to hear your views. With less than 1% of these players in academies making it as professional footballers, what's your thoughts? Like Brazil, you just mentioned there, Brazil, they don't go into academies till 12. I look at it and I think, so just for context, I've been the head of education in a professional football club previously. And I just see that when they get released from these academies, the support for them is really limited. And for me, those who have been in from a very young age have often missed out on that side of things, the social side of things, and develop with friends and that side of things. So is there an optimal age to be going into these academies? Or are you saying actually just get them in as early as possible? Or does it relate to, again, the child first? So if they go into that environment and it's right for them, then go in that environment.
Well, I mean, I think certainly it's got to be a good fit for the child. But, I mean, you are right. I mean, there are some interesting questions there in the sense of, I suppose, in a perfect world, kids would engage in a variety of different sports early on and then maybe specialize into the sport they have the greatest passion and interest in at an older age and then accumulate more hours in practice. But, of course, the reality of it is that there's a lot of kids who want to be professional football players. So if you don't begin to participate in the sport early on, then potentially you could end up with a practice deficit relative to, those who have invested the time more so within football. So I think my preference for the early engagement approach rather than a more diversified or early specialization approach is that you are still accumulating the hours in practice, but that if you want to participate in other sports, great. There's no particularly strong scientific evidence to suggest that the amount of transfer that occurs from those other sports is going to be beneficial to reaching expertise in the target sport of football for expertise. But clearly the advantages are it gives you more opportunity to socially interact with people. It allows you to develop a set of interests in different sports and activities that will last you through a lifetime, not necessarily in football. But, football is a clearly a cutthroat business. And the issue is there's so many kids who want to get onto that conveyor belt that invariably it is the survival of the fittest. And you're probably right in the sense that clubs could arguably do more to better support kids who don't progress within each of the academy environments. But I suppose if you're looking at it rather harshly from the academy's perspective, there's so many kids on that conveyor belt. And even that statement, that's an interesting statement, isn't it? Someone made a comment on LinkedIn the other day around the lines of the fact that less than 1% of players who join an academy actually make it to the Premier League. Is that necessarily a bad reflection on the academies, or is it just the fact that the number of places available at the top are relatively small? And in essence, you're not going to get 10, 20, 30% of academy trainees going through the system, because the reality of it is, there are far more places available in the academy structure than there is at the top end professional level. So it's a hugely competitive and sort of challenging environment. And I guess that's why some of these psychological characteristics like grit, resilience, mental toughness, even perfectionism, and a range of other factors are probably equally as important as tactical ability or physiological capacities in these instances.
It's an interesting question around the 1% thing, because I was part of the early development of the new apprenticeship in football. Yeah. And that was one of the questions asked around funding. If you were doing an apprenticeship in becoming a baker or a mechanic, your success rate wouldn't be 1% or less than 1% in terms of making it into that profession. So the big debate was around, what should this apprenticeship be? Should it be broader? Should it be wider? Should it be more specific on football? And if it is, and they're not getting a job at the end of it, which was linked to the education side, then kind of what are we doing here? What's the point? Not taking away from that fact that everybody there wants to be a professional footballer, and they all know those numbers. I've been there, I've stood there, I've told the kids this, this is the facts, but you're not trying to shatter dreams at the same time. I think it is a debate that I could probably do a whole podcast series on. So we'll probably come back to football a little bit there. But you've mentioned early specialisation, diversification.
I'll just one other point I'd probably like to raise there as well, actually, in the sense of it's difficult also, I think, in terms of the transition in the older age groups, isn't it? In the sense that, if you go through a Premier League academy, for instance, arguably you could have been in the academy since 6-8 years of age, and then you get to 18 or 19. Then it's very hard to get opportunities to play in the first team at that age. Hence why, of course, a lot of these clubs put players out on loan, for instance. Whereas, arguably, players from other countries who come through their youth system in, for instance, the Netherlands or Portugal, maybe they get those opportunities at an earlier age in terms of access to the first team, so that they're beginning to play at that level. And of course, some of them do quite well, and then because the Premier League clubs don't have a shortage of money, they buy those players from different countries, which makes it harder again for the players who go through the English academy system to progress to first team level. So I mean there are definitely barriers there. I mean, invariably the best players will find a way through some or other, but it is a relatively small factor. And yes, maybe more should be done in terms of catering for the educational needs of these kids and preparing them for life outside of football, because I would imagine that psychologically that's a real challenge for kids if they've been indoctrinized into that academy environment for such a prolonged period of time, and all of a sudden they're released by the club. That must be difficult for the kids and difficult for the parents.
Well, and with that, I can argue against myself there as well, because I could say, well, actually, if you're going to make it, you need to put everything into trying to make it, and you can't necessarily look at all these other things, and the consequences might be this. So, it goes around my head all the time, and there will always be different points of view on that that element. But football isn't the only sport where it's the same thing. So if we talk about, you mentioned early specialisation, diversification, early engagement. And I did see you post this on LinkedIn, and it's one of those things people always talk about, the 10,000 hours rule. In that context of, again, asking you far too many questions in the same element, there are many different sports. Are there some where you're saying, you need to early specialise here? Yes, you should do, well, I know you say this, 10,000 hours might be around where it is, but it could actually be 20,000, it could be 5,000. Can you speak to that? And possibly around your statement the other day, actually, on LinkedIn, around this is where the 10,000 hours came from, and this is the story of more hours, less hours, early specialisation, early engagement.
Yeah, can do. I mean, the original story came from some work that Anders Ericsson, a well-known cognitive scientist who sadly passed away a few years ago now, he did some work with groups of musicians at an academy in Berlin. And he used questionnaires and semi-structured interviews to look back retrospectively at the hours that they'd been engaging in practice. And the main finding was that the elite professional musicians had accumulated around 10,000 hours. Or 10 years of practice in the sport. And then I think possibly around that other time, there might have been a couple of other studies where this 10,000 hours came up quite frequently. And it was actually Malcolm Gladwell in his book Outliers who sort of converted it into a rule per se, in the argument that, whatever you do, you need to accumulate 10,000 hours or of 10 years of investment in the activity to become an elite performer. But, the actual hours that are needed to become an elite athlete are very much sport dependent. It depends on the cultural popularity of the sport. It depends on the extent to which early engagement or specialization is the norm, in the sense of you don't want to end up with this practice deficit. It probably depends on the technical and tactical demands of the sport. Some sports are obviously more heavily driven by physical and physiological characteristics, whereas others are more heavily reliant on technical and tactical ability. Certainly, I would think in sports like football, tennis, golf, basketball, I would say that early engagement would be the norm, and that the kinds of hours that I'm talking, even skiing actually is an early engagement sport. Kids start at 2, they're getting coaching at 4, and professional skiers actually accumulate around 8,000 hours of practice in skiing by the age of 18. So they're what I would call early engagement sports. I'm not sure early specialization is necessary or even desired, actually. I mean, there are some sports that have been early specialization based, like gymnastics. But at the end of the day, it's not really about whether they specialize or not, it's whether they're accumulating enough practice. So if they're accumulating enough practice in, say, gymnastics, it doesn't mean that they can't participate in other sports. I said we don't know if anything transfers or not, but certainly in terms of the overall development of the child, I would encourage them to do that. I mean, there are other sports, like arguably rowing, for instance, or even cycling, where maybe those are sports that are much more heavily dependent on physical and physiological attributes. And there is evidence that, maybe you can win an Olympic gold after 4,000 hours of Helen Glover, for instance, had only accumulated around 4,000 to 5,000 hours before she won gold in rowing at the Olympics. So, that's not a sport that's heavily dependent on technical ability, ball mastery, for instance. So yes, there is no such thing really as the 10,000 hour rule or the 10-year rule. And ultimately, it's a combination of the quantity of practice, the quality of practice, and the nature of the sport and the extent of the cultural popularity of that sport.
I think we'll dig into that a little bit more next. I'm going to ask you this final question that's linked to the kind of serendipity piece. And again, this could probably be a whole podcast. But what's your perception on athletes born or made? How much does genetics play within this?
Yeah, I mean, that's the perennial debate, isn't it? I'm not dismissing the fact that genetics do play some role. And I can easily see that genetics may have some impact on your responsiveness to training, not just in terms of the development of physiological characteristics, but also arguably tactical abilities as well. I mean, I don't think the evidence has progressed to the extent that we know what those genes are, what combination of those genes and how they're expressed has that impact. A statement that I would make all the time, actually, is this: far more people have the necessary genetic characteristics to be elite performers than actually become elite performers. So probably opportunity is as big a factor as anything. There are probably, arguably, for instance, if I'd have been born in the Alps and out skiing every day, I mightn't have been an elite skier, but I wasn't. I was born in Wales, not far from a mountain, but there wasn't too much snow on that mountain. So obviously I didn't turn to skiing. So having that opportunity and having the right network and support system is for me more important, but I don't dismiss the fact that arguably there may be some genetic characteristics that are important, except I don't think we particularly know what they are for now. So my view would be, let's focus on the things we know have a significant impact and make sure that we are better at creating the right environments and providing the right practice opportunities for these athletes to be able to develop the skills and the characteristics that are important to progress.
It's a really good point. It speaks very nicely to everything you've just said and made me think, actually, how many of us ever reach our optimal performance in anything? Those elite athletes are probably those who are doing that due to many of the factors that we've just talked about.
I think it's an interesting point you raised, actually. Another point that Ericsson made quite a bit is he differentiated, if you like, between different types of practice. And what he suggested, of course, was that a lot of us suffer from what's called arrested development, in the sense that once we get to a certain level of competence, we continue to engage in practice in the same way. In other words, we accumulate most of our time in maintenance practice, and therefore performance doesn't improve. We've just plateaued. Whereas what he says is experts avoid the onset of arrested development by developing deliberate practice activities, what some have referred to as growth practice, so that they actually continue to work on weaknesses and to improve attributes, so that they continue to progress up that pyramid towards excellence. And this is why he argued that actually experience on task is not actually highly correlated with performance. What he said was that it's actually the hours accumulated in deliberate practice, which is high quality practice with the specific intention of improving some aspects of performance, that is important towards creating expertise.
You've perfectly kind of segued as to where I was going. So I was going to now say, well, let's really focus on that, the kind of training smarter and the science of success that the chapter's called in your book. And you've mentioned there deliberate practice, and I think we'll get to that. But you mentioned previously in the podcast, you talked about blocked practice and variable practice and then deliberate practice. Can you talk us through, just for our audience, to understand what that is? So what's blocked practice? What's variable practice? what's deliberate practice, and then maybe we'll talk about how we could try to implement those things.
Yeah, blocked practice, for instance, is if I go to the golf driving range with my bucket of balls and I get a club out 7-iron and I play 100 repetitive shots with that 7-iron, then that's blocked practice. Random practice is that I might play a shot with the 7-iron, then get the 3-iron, then get the pitching wedge, then get the driver out. So in other words, you're constantly introducing randomness into how practice is structured and scheduled. And then there's variability practice, which is also engaged in that randomness. So variable practice would be if I've got my 7-iron out and I play 100 shots, so that's block practice, to a flag that's 100 yards away, then that's specific practice. Whereas if I use the same club and I play it to 95 yards, 98 yards, 104 yards, 105 yards, that's variable practice. So the kinds of scenarios which have quite commonly been referred to as being blocked and repetitive would be sort of drill and grid-based activities where people are practicing technical skills in a constrained, repetitive manner, often without sort of having the same tactical, strategic decision-making demands as during match playing and competition. So the challenge all the time for coaches actually is getting the balance right between repetition and specificity. So repetition is the frequency of attempts at that skill, whereas specificity is the extent to which the practice environment mimics the competition environment. And clearly, I think what historically there's been a tendency to do is for coaches to often sacrifice specificity for repetition. So by moving from, let's say, a game situation to creating these drill and grid-based practices, what you're doing is you're increasing the opportunity for repetition of key technical skills, for instance, but at the same time, of course, specificity reduces because aspects of the decision-making is very, very different. Personally, I'm a big specificity guy, so ideally what you want, of course, is high levels of repetition, high levels of specificity, but that's very hard in a coaching environment. But if I had to choose between the two, I'd go high specificity and low repetition. Because if you high repetition, low specificity, then what are you actually practicing? You're practicing something a lot, but it's not actually a good replication of the demands of match playing competition. So I think the problem historically is that coaches have put too much emphasis on repetition and not enough emphasis on specificity. And why that has happened as well is because that when a coach is delivering a coaching session, practice session, what he or she sees is performance of those kids in that environment. And clearly, if you do a high level of repetitive drill scenarios, performance is quite good. But then the evidence suggests that performance doesn't actually retain over time and doesn't transfer to match play and competition. So we have this paradox in the sense that if I want the best performance during practice, that I should provide lots of instruction, do specific block practice of single skills and provide lots of feedback. Whereas conversely, paradoxically, the reverse is true in terms of facilitating optimal learning. So then I might think as a coach, what is the least amount of instruction that I need to provide these athletes so they have the opportunity to practice the skill? Are my practice conditions dynamic, variable, and random, high in specificity, such that they match the demands of competition, technically, tactically, psychologically, physiologically? And what is the least amount of feedback I need to give so that the player can begin to, learn to make his or her own decisions? And so that's a little bit more of a hands-off. So that's better for long-term learning.
So one of the statements I was going to read to you was that in your book is what is best for short-term performance is not always best for long-term learning and performance, which is exactly what you've just talked us through there. I mean, yeah. It brings me to so many questions that we're probably not going to have time to cover. But obviously, from a coaching perspective and, lower down the chain of coaching, you might be running a session and you might see, the performance improve in your training session because you've drilled it, you've continuously done it. And in my experience with coaches, and this specific one was around Olympic weightlifting, and I was okay at Olympic weightlifting, and an Olympic level coach came in to coach us for some session, and he came in and the only instruction he gave to me was to move my hands about half an inch. And within that same session that he was there, I increased my PB by 10 kilos. which was a huge increase. And that was probably the first time, I might have been early 20s back then. It was probably the first real time that I kind of started to think about elite coaches actually doing less but achieving more, based on their years and years of knowledge. And it's so difficult for anybody, even at elite level or but especially grassroots level, to understand. Often with performance development long term, less is more.
Yeah.
Would you see that as something that coaches have started to do or do more? Or where do people as coaches develop in that sense?
Well, I think certainly if you went back historically 2-3 decades ago, then I think very prescriptive approach to coaching was the norm. Maybe in some sports more than others, but generally, it was, the philosophy was, I'm the coach, I have all the knowledge, and I will give it to you as the learner. So heavy reliance on feedback, instruction, block repetitive practice. As our scientific understanding of how people learn has grown over the last few decades, then now there is increasing awareness that the learner also has a significant responsibility in this process of learning, and that what we have to do as a coach is create an environment and act as a catalyst, if you like, to facilitate learning. And to put as much emphasis on the learner to problem solve as possible. So we've shifted towards, as I said, rather than sort of very prescriptive instruction, to provide the least amount of instruction possible, maybe even to rely on sort of instructions related to an external focus in terms of, what is I want you to do with the ball, what shape and ball flight do I need, rather than the mechanics of the action per se. This notion of moving towards high level of specificity, and again, providing less amounts of instruction. And the evidence has shown that clearly facilitates learning. What I will say, however, is that, my view is coaching is an art form, and that art can be informed by science. So I always say that when I do coach education workshops, I usually start off by saying, if you're expecting answers or recipe books for coaching, you're going to be disappointed. That my role as a scientist here is to enhance your professional knowledge about learning and how people learn in different types of environments. But ultimately, there's a huge amount of art or craft knowledge in coaching in regards to, for instance, even in terms of the use of these constraints-based approaches, in terms of the argument that you try and manipulate constraints in the environment, where there's the availability of space, like the instruction that your coach gave to you in the weightlifting scenario about, as I said, moving your hands to a certain degree, or whatever you said earlier on. I mean, the model doesn't tell you what constraints to change and when. That comes from your craft knowledge as a coach. And of course, that comes partly because you've been in those situations so many different times, you've tried different things, and you've realized that if you change this constraint, then this is how behavior typically changes in that environment. So then you're able to action that approach. So I'm a big supporter of constraints-based approaches, but as I said, I do think they're much easier to be applied if you're a highly experienced coach who's got years of experience and accumulated that craft knowledge and then integrated it with the professional knowledge. Whereas I think it's difficult if you're starting off as a novice coach, because you just don't have that level of craft knowledge. And in that regard, knowing exactly what to manipulate and when is quite difficult.
Definitely is, and the coach education, that's why coach education experience is so important. Yet again, we're kind of coming to the final section, and yet again, you've moved us towards it very nicely. And I'm going to ask you a couple of very open questions that I think will lead to some further discussion. So, just looking at the power of coaching. So, what, in your opinion, what do the best coaches do, and how do they do it, and what benefits do those top level coaches bring to performance?
Yeah, I mean, that's a very wide-ranging question, isn't it? In the sense that clearly the role of a coach is very multifaceted. And I guess to some degree, my specific area of expertise is around optimizing the use of practice time. And so I'll make some comment on that. But clearly, I appreciate the fact that that's just a part of the role. And actually, you could argue that at the very elite level, it may well be that the high-end coaches don't actually spend too much time with their athletes on the field, in that most of that role is about managing people, managing the environment, and getting everything right during training and during match play, so that they often leave the coaching per se and the skill development aspect to deputy coaches, for instance. But in terms of the skill learning perspective, then I think it's that. It's knowing when to focus on performance, actually, because there are times that you do need to focus on performance. I mean, arguably, if I've got a big game tomorrow or a competition tomorrow, for instance, and the amount of learning that is going to take place today that is going to impact tomorrow is minimal. So maybe what's important in practice the day before is that performance is good, and therefore that raises levels of confidence and self-efficacy going into the game tomorrow. So as a coach, you need to know when do you focus on performance, but when do you focus on learning? And then you need to think about the types of athletes and players that you want to create, because ultimately those players are a product of the environment. So if you want players to be independent and creative in the performance setting, then clearly you have to create environments which match that. So it's the challenge is deciding also when to be hands-on and when to be hands-off, and when to be prescriptive and when to shape and mold the learning environment such that player behavior evolves through that practice rather than you prescribing it or dictating it onto the athletes. So that's probably that constant issue. When performance, when learning, when to be hands-on, when to be hands-off. I think probably they're the key challenges for a coach from the skill learning side of things.
And does that differ based on age and performance level of that individual? Because I'm aware we're often talking here about trying to develop an elite athlete, which is what we're talking about. But at that novice stage, at 5, 6, 7, 8, whatever. Let's talk footballers specifically again, if we want. Are we saying actually we need to spend a lot of time just teaching them to pass a ball, or are we saying no, just let's go discovery learning? They'll learn how to do that. Just let them get on with it. I presume it's somewhere in between. But does that change from whatever, a 5, 6, 7-year-old to an 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, or from a novice to an elite athlete? Does that question make sense?
Well, yeah, it does, absolutely. And I think it's a crucial question in many aspects because it dictates curriculum right across the academy system. We probably don't have enough research that has begun to look at those issues, in the sense that, historically, arguably the approach has been start off prescriptive and reduce the amount of prescription over time. And then there's probably evidence to suggest that maybe we should start with low levels of prescriptive coaching and just allow the kids to play. The classical approach is drill to small-sided games. And in fact, we did a study about 10 years ago now where we videotaped 80-odd football coaches working with kids in the academy environment. And we coded what they were doing within each coaching session. And what we found was that 65% of the time in each session, the coaches were having players engage in physical work, warming up, warming down, sprint training, technical practice with the ball but without an opponent, or skills practice, which was with the ball with an opponent, but only one opponent. No decision-making aspect per se, or strong decision-making aspect. And only 35% of the time were they engaging in playing form activity, which is small-sided games, conditioned games, match play. And so typically, of course, coaches used to have the classic approach of doing all this training form activity for most of the session and then having the kids end with a game at the end. And there has been a shift around. I think the FA, I believe, gathered some similar data a few years ago, and they now found that coaches were having kids spend 65% of the time in playing form and only 35% rather in training form activity. So there has been a cultural shift, but I guess there are still a lot of interesting questions. And what's the optimal balance between training form and playing form, and how should that change as a function of age, skill level, and development? I mean, invariably, the overall guidance that the model that fits in perfectly, I guess, is you need to look at, in a long-term talent development model, you need to look at, okay, what do you want your players to look like at senior level? What are they able to do and not able to do? And therefore, you need to create an environment that facilitates the development of those skills and competencies. And I remember doing a workshop for the MLS a few years ago, and I think that was one of the complaints that the head coaches of the MLS teams had, in the sense that, they were having no impact on the development of these kids, and they were ending up with a certain type of player in the adult age groups of the MLS level. And clearly those types of players weren't a fit with the way they wanted to play or the way they wanted to cope. And that's difficult. But of course, the challenge is there's not too many head coaches and managers that have a prolonged involvement with the club sufficiently to be able to shape the system from top to bottom. or bottom to top rather. And I guess it does probably strengthen the argument to have staff at the club that are there long term, and then to bring in a head coach, as opposed to what has historically happened more often than not, is that the head coach comes in and he brings in a whole pile of new coaches with him, which changes the overall philosophy of the club. So there's an element of short-termism to that, I guess, and not many clubs probably have that stability through the academy into the first team.
Well, just to finish, and you'll know much more than I, so what's the situation at Barcelona with La Masia? And I think more of a European model would have a structure a bit more like you're talking about, whether it be a director of football or academy that staff are there much more long term, and the head coach does change, which the Premiership seems to be moving towards, although I know many of the backroom staff move with the head coach. So I think in the book you talk about discovery learning at La Masia. What kind of age are they going into that, and what's the situation that they're in the development? Because I think from some of the research I read, there are more Spanish professional footballers than any other country in Europe. I may have read that from your work or somewhere else.
Yeah, I don't know the specific data actually in terms of how many players join the academy each year and what the progression rates are through to the first team. I think, yes, there is a section in the book I had the opportunity to visit. I've visited a few times before over the years, actually. And I mean, the two things that stood out for me is that they have a director of methodology. So this is someone actually who works across the academies, focusing around some of these things that we're talking about in terms of how do we optimize the use of practice time? How do we best present instruction? How do we best structure practice, etc.? So there is a real focus on optimizing the use of practice time. I mean, arguably, of course, this is probably a key question in not just in sport, but across a whole range of domains, in the sense of, well, how do we optimize the return on every hour of practice? And for every hour of practice, what proportion of that transfers into an improvement in performance in the competitive environment?
How do you measure that?
Right? Well, that's the problem, isn't it? It's a real challenge to measure. And if I knew how to measure it, I probably wouldn't be on the podcast with you. I'd be on a beach somewhere in the Caribbean. But, that is the interesting question. But let's make a guess, right? Think of all the difficulties from a coach perspective in the sense of, being able to differentiate between performance and learning. Am I developing performance or am I developing learning? Think about, how do I manipulate the level of difficulty in the practice? Because for some players, it will be maintenance practice. They'll already be good at that skills. For other players, it'll be growth practice. So how do I create the appropriate level of difficulty? Massive individual differences within that group of players. I might have 16 players of varying abilities, skill levels. So, what is the return? I mean, let's say 30%. Let's say 30%, right? Let's be generous. So 30% of every hour of practice transfers to an improvement in performance on the field. I mean, ultimately, what we want, of course, is to then increase that from 30 to 40%. Or 40 to 50%, certainly to optimize the return on every hour of practice. And this is where I think we need to better integrate the science, the professional knowledge of coaching with the art of coaching. And I think probably, I'm not saying Barcelona are exceptionally good at doing that, but I think they do it better than a lot of other places. I still think that more investment is needed in that area. And then the second bit that I liked about Barcelona is they had a very strong focus on research and innovation. And I think this is an area where historically clubs have underinvested. I mean, if you think about Fortune 100 companies, for instance, I mean, they spend on average 4 to 5% of their GDP on research and innovation to stay ahead of the game. So if you ask the question, well, how much of their GDP do Premier League football clubs spend on research and innovation? Then it's probably quite negligible. So I think the club should consider, as per Barcelona, developing a stronger research and innovation focus, pointing ahead of research and innovation. And that would then help guide some of those questions around how do we optimize every hour of practice and skill development.
And again, I can biasly sit here and agree with you that they do need to do that, but it's often and football is changing, but it has for years been a closed shop of professional players and the same networks and all the rest of it. I don't know. I see that as changing a little.
It's changed a lot. Yeah, it's changed a lot.
So hopefully it goes down that way.
I mean, if you think about it, I was at John Moores University. I launched the science and football program there in, I think it was 1995. And there were very few sports scientists in the club environments now. And now it's grown massively. Although, to some degree, the majority of these sports science appointments are on the fitness and conditioning side of performance, maybe diet and nutrition. A lot of focus on data analytics, match analysis as well. I think still probably we have a shortage of sports psychologists, probably generally, although of course most of the academies have them, depending on the categorization of those academies. But we still have very few people focusing on skill acquisition.
Which is really interesting. Really interesting.
Which, I think is the future in the sense of that simple question of, for every hour of practice, how do we make sure that we're optimizing the return on that? What do we know about how people learn, and how do we integrate that knowledge on the science of learning into coaching practice is crucial. And I suppose bringing it round to your original question, I think maybe Barcelona have done better than most in that regard. But do I think the football clubs could do better? Yes, I do, 100%.
Mark, I knew this would happen. I mean, I could probably talk to you for hours and hours and hours, but we've pretty much run out of time. So hugely appreciate. I mean, anyone who's interested in any of these, the vast array of topics we've talked about, we've barely scratched the surface of what you talk about in the book, and we've not even touched upon psychology. So anybody who's interested in this, go and read the book. There's loads of different examples of it around there. And those that are interested in coaching and skill acquisition, I know, Mark, you've got lots of other things that are out there and books and things like that, potentially more academic, that people can go and take a look at.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I do have a number of other books on skill acquisition and science and soccer, for instance. But I really like the book, The Best How Elite Athletes Are Made, actually. I mean, it sold okay. It would have, I thought it might have sold a little bit better. I think we had two disadvantages. Firstly, it came out during COVID, which didn't help. Went under the radar a little bit. Secondly, it's not a sensationalist book.
Yeah.
And I think the problem as a society is that we actually see everything as black and white.
Yeah.
And this is what Malcolm Gladwell's done with his book Outliers, and actually the other guy who's written the book recently about range, David Epstein, his book on specialisation and diversity. I mean, I read those books and I go, you just can't say that. You just can't, because they take a minimal amount of science and they spin it into black and white, and they create a sensationalist aspect to it. Whereas this book is true to the science, and arguably maybe that makes it a little bit less exciting, in the sense that I acknowledge the fact that there are lots of things we don't know the answer to. And I think at one point in the book, when we talk about specialisation and diversity and the relative benefits, I think we go with it depends. Because there isn't an easy answer to the question.
You've done it again. You've absolutely taken the words from me. In concluding, I was literally going to say, as is always the case when I speak to many academics in all different areas, what's the answer to the question I'm trying to ask? There's no answer. It depends is always the answer. And I think for anybody interested in this space, it comes back to kind of understanding where you want to be and what you want to do, whether that's developing an elite athlete or developing your own coaching style and things like that. It depends. And a lot of the things that you need to do, sometimes it's trial and error. So go and try some blocked practice or variable practice, some discovery learning, see what starts to manifest. But you can't expect results in 1 hour session. You were saying before, 30% improvement being a very out there number to say that they might improve by that. When it comes back to what this original question was about how to develop elite athletes, there are ultimately an endless supply of reasons for someone to become an elite athlete. But there's all the luck side of things that you talked about, this psychology that we've not talked about. But if people want to become an elite athlete, then it comes back to practice in the right environment, surrounded by the right people and the right coaches, and there's a big level of luck, but the controllable that you can have is to practice and be part of it. I think that's an underlying message of what we're trying to say here.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think that's a good point. We can't control everything, but what we can try and do is optimize what we can control. And exposure and type of practice is something that we have some control over. And And I think where we need to focus our efforts in terms of integrating the science with the craft aspect of coaching, I think that's crucial moving forward.
Well, that was my final question that we'll leave on. What's the next things for you? What's the next things for your research? And also in this space of research, where does it need to go now?
Yeah, I mean, obviously I've got a background in motor learning skill acquisition, and that's where my biggest passion is. But I do think that there's a couple of areas that I'm particularly interested. Well, there's 3 areas that I'm particularly interested in. I've got some projects ongoing at the moment. One is that question that was articulated a minute ago in terms of how do we integrate the science of skill learning into the craft of coaching and optimize the return on every hour of practice. The second area that I'm interested in is actually my main area of expertise is on perception and decision making and game intelligence, for instance. How do we improve anticipation and decision making kids in not just in athletes but in warfighters, in pilots, in all sorts of different professional domains. So I'm very interested in what kind of learning environments do we create. Particularly interested maybe in using virtual reality to recreate, again, this balance between specificity and repetition. The advantage of VR, of course, is it gives you opportunities to provide high levels of repetition from a decision-making perspective, whereas clearly there are still concerns around specificity, but the specificity is getting better. So how can we, it may not exclusively involve VR, but how do we better test, measure, and develop game intelligence skills in athletes? I think that would be a key step moving forward. And thirdly, I'm also interested in, got some projects going in the area of talent identification in terms of looking at, are there any early predictors of talent? I mean, clearly there's been a lot of work over the years on talent ID, but most of it has been cross-sectional, just comparing within particular age or skill groups. And most of it has been monodisciplinary. So with one of the Premier League clubs, we are in the process of developing longitudinal multidisciplinary test batteries to see whether any of these characteristics, physical, physiological, technical, tactical, psychological, sociological, can differentiate over time, and to what extent these kinds of measures can support subjective opinions of coaches in terms of deciding who progresses and who doesn't within the academy environment. So those are probably the 3 areas that are taking up most of my time at the moment.
They all sound really... Look, I could talk to you for an hour plus about every single one of those areas. So, again, really appreciate you going on. I really look forward to seeing where you go in those spaces. And I would definitely say when you're in a space with any of those and you want to come and chat again, then please come back. We will have a conversation again, because it's been really insightful speaking to you broadly about all these things, and I think in the future it'd be really nice to speak more specifically to some of those pieces you talked about there. So thanks for coming on. It's been an absolute pleasure.
My pleasure, and I hope your listeners get something interesting out of it. But have a great day. Nice to catch up.
Thanks for listening to the Experts in Sport podcast. If you'd like to get in touch, then please contact me, Martin Foster, at m.foster@loughborough.ac.uk. Thanks for listening. See you next time.